Very good. All right, let's do it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Product Vision versus Engineering Reality. And for those of you expecting it, this webinar isn't going to be some sort of like a cage match between the two schools of thought, but this is a conflict that we see come up a lot with our client engagements. So we thought it'd be a great topic to cover. The product owners and the software engineers are two really important parts of the product development team. But unfortunately, it can sometimes be really hard for them to understand each other's more unique perspectives. So in this webinar, we'll be sharing strategies to help bridge the gap between that product vision and the engineering reality, really for more effective communication and better product development across the line. We got a lot to cover today, and I want to make sure we leave some space for questions at the end. So let's jump right in. First, we'll have our panel introduce ourselves. My name is Joe Dallacqua. I'm going to be moderating. I'm a principal consultant at RSI, and as the head of the design practice, I've worked with a lot of different product owners to help kind of bring their visions to life. So for the purpose of the conversation today, I'll be speaking mostly from the product owner or PO perspective. Zack, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Zack Lynch. I'm a senior consultant at RSI. I've been developing since about 2005. And I'll be kind of representing the software engineering side of the conversation today.
Great, Britt.
Hello, I'm Brittany Chance. Everyone calls me Britt. I'm a senior product strategist here at RSI. And that product strategist role really ranges from product owner, product manager, product coach, really dependent on the client's needs. Also have 10 years as a business analyst, so I will be speaking mostly to the product side, but the business analyst side has also influenced me in a lot of what I'll be saying today.
And Larissa.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Larissa, and I am a principal consultant at RSI, and I'm in the business analyst practice. I've been doing business analyst and software development work for almost 30 years. So in today's discussion, I'll be focusing on the business analyst perspective.
Great. Thanks, guys. So to just set the stage a little bit, I think we want to start by talking about some overall talent challenges that the different perspectives see from day to day. So Zack, can you kick us off, talk about kind of the 10,000-foot view?
Sure thing. Well, there's a lot of stuff that engineering does. There are challenges in and of themselves, so I'm going to focus on engineering, things related to this working with product. So I would say first, in order to be our most valuable, engineers got to understand the nature of the business and the problems that business solves. Without a clear understanding of the problems, there's a lot of room for assumption. And a piece of software is essentially a set of instructions, and who gives those instructions matters. A good example would be my first professor in college. She had a peanut butter sandwich example. She'd bring in a nice loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and ask her how to make a peanut butter sandwich. And somebody would, of course, say, put the peanut butter on the bread. And she'd take the jar and put it on the unopened bag of bread. And that's kind of how it starts. So you'll notice that if we receive a story or spec with very little acceptance criteria or interaction with we're going to end up connecting these dots ourselves, and that might lead to unintended outcomes or consequences. So while there are great patterns for tooling, build processes, linting, CI/CD, deployment, when it comes down to business logic, we need to talk to the business and we need them to talk to us. So if you have a developer on your hands that is asking loads of questions and being really pedantic about phrasing, so that, let's say a title like product engineering versus, or product vision versus engineering reality isn't a conflict, right? Just like Joe brought up, we're careful with our words so we understand what we're doing, and communication is key. So that's kind of how that all works on the software engineering side.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is from the product side, what we see a lot of is unless the business itself is producing software products, when we come to software development, we're already starting at a complete disadvantage, right? We don't understand the processes. We don't understand the roles. We don't understand the terminology. We have some sense of it, right? We've seen it before, or we may have done it before, but unless we're living in it every day, we just don't have that same perspective. But we still need someone who can understand the needs of our business, right? Without me learning how to engineer it, right? If I knew how to break it down that way, I would be an engineer. So what I'm looking for as a product owner is really someone who can take that industry and that business knowledge and just kind of translate it and just make it happen. So those are two very distinct schools of thought and places to be. So Britt and Larissa, what do we do?
Yeah, so I think from the business analyst perspective, our major goal is to be that bridge in the business logic and the business process knowledge to the engineering, so that we're making sure that that's communicated correctly, and in reverse, understanding enough about the engineering world to make sure that we're asking the questions in the right way and retrieving the information. But on the business side, it's really critical that we are learning everything we know or that we can know about the business, whether it's a new industry or a new vertical that we're working in, and relying on the experience that we've had in the past so that we can ask questions instead of just expecting the business to say, this is what I want, to know kind of what questions to use to probe and say, okay, you don't know what you want, you don't know what, but I bet you know this. And if we break down the questions a little bit more, we can get them to describe their vision in a way that we can then translate into requirements for the engineers.
Yeah, and Joe and Larissa, you both bring up really good points from a product business analyst perspective. Oftentimes we find ourselves in situations as consultants where being in a product role and going, to help a client on an engagement, we're sometimes and most of the time working with, product departments, engineering departments, and those don't necessarily always talk to each other, well, or have those conversations that they should have to really understand how to bridge that gap between a product vision and an engineering reality. So putting ourselves in those situations and positions and just making sure that we have empathy for those situations, because I'm sure that we've also been in that scenario before, and just making sure that we are really bridging that gap and getting everyone into the room together as soon as possible and having those conversations, facilitating communication, and just making sure that we're working as one team as early as possible in the engagement. And that's one of the things that I always try to, put into place as soon as an engagement starts.
So speaking of those awkward conversations, one of the things we see on the product side a lot, and a conversation that comes up a lot, is this concept of tech debt, right? And we've all had the conversation, like, it can be good, fast, or cheap. You can pick two. And on the product side, it's like, well, we would like it to be good, fast, and cheap. But really our focus is how do we get the most out of the investment, right? So if I'm building something totally greenfield, something totally new, I don't understand how it could wind up with tech debt, right? It seems like tech debt is sometimes used as an excuse to like pad timelines that go beyond the goals, or, and when we talk about tech debt, it seems like the impact to the business goals aren't usually considered or understood because they just say like, this is something that needs to be fixed. And sometimes it's tough to know, even where it came from. And it can be really frustrating when the delays or increased cost or whichever are related to things that seem ambiguous, right? If someone tells me a decision is going to increase tech debt, it's really hard from the product perspective to understand what that means to me. So tech debt is this conversation that seems like it's always looming and just gets dropped out at the most inconvenient times. So Zack, what do you got on tech debt?
So, developers can accomplish most tasks laid out before them, but as we've mentioned with most things in life, they're going to be trade-offs in time, expense, and quality. The more difficult or novel a problem is going to be to solve, the more time it's going to take. But sometimes we don't have that time. Things need to get done, and I think developers would like to take all the time in the world, but we don't have that. So much like financial debt, technical debt is a calculated risk. It's an understandable choice to take on debt if your roof is leaking into your kitchen. Similarly, if we need to get a feature done sooner than later due to a business necessity, a an ad on the Super Bowl, something like really critical. We may need to get that solution out faster than we'd like to. What that means effectively is that sometimes we're going to have something that is not a robust solution. It's got sharp edges. It's got some logical problems, and the real problem is that often things are not re-examined. So we take on this risk of having a rough, hastily built solution, then working its way through the rest of our application. So if we, we're prone to reuse things, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel all the time. And if we have a wheel that's maybe more trapezoidal than it is round, that's eventually going to cause problems with how things work out. And so it's really important to kind of communicate that we are, taking on this tech debt, that we are, cutting corners is a harsh word, but that we're kind of cutting corners here to meet this deadline. Acknowledge it and realize that we need to go back and address it, or else it's going to cause problems at some level. It will either introduce unnecessary complexity into the application that causes breakdown. It's going to be confusing to new devs who come on. They don't understand why this thing was done this way. And you're going to pay for that. It's a debt because you're going to pay for it. We may hit this deadline, but you're going to miss the next. And that's kind of how all that really works, at a high level.
Britt, what do we do about it?
I think from a product perspective and from anyone's perspective, when you're working on a project and working on software, moving too quickly never provides any benefit. We're seeing that time and time again when things are rushed or they're not planned out, or priorities are shifted. Things happen, defects happen, tech debt happens. And it can result in a really buggy product and ultimately not fulfill the product vision that, we're talking about. So, when we're looking from a product perspective, risks and business factors are always considered in the prioritization conversations that we're having regularly. We're always thinking ahead, and partnering with our stakeholders to make sure that we're keeping everything on track. We're not only taking into account the logical orders of like epics and features for the product, but any factors that could possibly impact timeline, such as other company priorities, dependencies on other teams, tech debt, defects, and making sure that we're having those conversations, like Zack said, communicating and making sure that we are getting those taken care of when they should be taken care of instead of just saving them for last. So having those conversations ahead of time, thinking ahead, looking at it holistically, and really just putting all of that into place.
Nice. Larissa, any follow-ups?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the example of a green screen, it's all new, and how do we have tech debt? And I think in my experience, we've had a shift to, as we've shifted into the agile world, we've lost some of that strategic pre-thought, where we do take a little bit of time to think through the scope, to think through a little bit of the edge cases and the gotchas, and make sure that we're aware of where we might be building tech debt. So, yes, tech debt can come at any time, but generally we can have some idea of what we might be getting into before it happens. So I think if we take a step back, if we don't, jump into sprint zero, or we get the right people in the right room together sooner in the project, then it's helpful to alleviate.
Nice. It's interesting. Zack mentioned the Super Bowl problem, which is something that comes up a lot. The idea of like sometimes a deadline is a deadline. And the Super Bowl, for example, for those of you who don't know, is like if you have a product that has to drop by the Super Bowl, that's not a date you can move. It's there. So whatever it is that you're going to produce has to be done by that time. And sometimes on the product side, right, those deadlines are just as important, even though it's not something quite so epic as the Super Bowl. But if it needs to be done by March 30th, it needs to be done by March 30th. How do we how do we have those conversations, right? It's tough when you're working in Agile. It feels like sometimes the priorities are shifting or things are bouncing back and forth. But when the deadline's the deadline, you know, Zach, what does that look like from the engineering perspective?
Well, deadlines are real and they're important. They're critical to help us maintain focus on what's important about a project. I think it's really necessary upfront to understand what is critical about something that's going to be delivered. I think most visions are multifaceted, and it's really critical upfront as we're doing the agile process to identify when things might be going off rail, how we keep it on rail, what things you may be able to drop off to keep things moving forward. That's kind of really critical, is kind of keeping in constant communication. That's going to be an overarching theme of everything I say. Keeping constant communication with your peers in product to understand like what is actually valuable here. Is there anything that we can drop off? The answer is always going to be no at first. The whole thing needs to be done. But if we can't get anything done for the sake of the whole, that's going to be a problem. There are also unexpected and unrealistic deadlines, and those are kind of a different animal. I've been on a number of projects throughout my career where the first thing I knew about a project was its deadline. I don't know what it is, but I know what to do. That's a kind of a hard spot to be in. I've also had so many deadlines that were just stated as the nearest chronological holiday. It doesn't feel real. It's just the nearest date you can think of. And so with that in mind, you know, it's kind of indicative of an organization that's not valuing communication between its product and technology teams. And that lack of communication can lead to a loss of credibility, and inevitably builds technical debt, because we're going to have to shortcut something somewhere. And it leaves the teams maybe a little bit at odds, which is unfortunate. And, you know, again, the best way to kind of deal with this is just keep up that communication. Let the product team know where we're at, where we stand, and offer, you know, solutions or alternatives in the event things look like they're maybe not looking great for a final complete full release. Maybe we can get a 95% of the way there release ready to go. But bring that up early. Nobody wants to hear that at the last minute. And so that constant communication is very, very critical.
You know, it's funny, I hadn't really thought about it in that way before, but I can't count the number of projects I've worked on where the first thing I've heard is the deadline. And the second thing I heard is what we're going to do by that deadline, without anyone actually asking, can this be done by this time? And that's a tough place to start. So Larissa or Britt, either way, talk about deadlines.
Yeah, I think I just want to share from the BA perspective. I always have like contingency plans running in my head. So while the requirements might be the requirements, I'm always preparing for what might be coming and where we could shift or change if the dev takes longer than expected or the deadline shifts a little bit. But I know Britt's got a little more thoughts on how to manage deadlines.
First thought is it's just funny to be able to tell that how Zach and I have worked together previously on projects from an engineering and product partnership, because for both of us, communication, like we're going to talk about it constantly because it is one of the most important facets. Some of the things that I like to do, you know, kind of on before it gets to the rest of the team, to the delivery team, is first keep the understanding that deadlines aren't anyone's fault. And sometimes that can be what it's looked at as, is because so-and-so said this is the deadline, that's what we have to do. It's their fault. Let's never look at it that way. But first, understand what's driving that deadline. Is it something that is as hard of a deadline like Super Bowl Sunday? Or is it a stakeholder's need to see progress? Is it revenue impacting? Knowing the thought process behind what is driving the deadline really helps determine if there are items that can be addressed. You know, instead of just saying, this is the deadline, we need to meet it. Can we do regular demos of progress? Can we have more conversations that maybe we're not having? And then also understanding user impact and priorities. So what needs to shift in order to resolve those issues? Are there features with functions that, can be handled via a workaround versus features that absolutely have to work this particular way, work properly. And really understanding that kind of information so that when I do have conversations with the team about deadlines, we're, communicating why and understanding why and the purpose behind it instead of just saying, this is it, end of story. Giving a little bit of that background behind it, I found has really helped, the communication and help keep everyone on the same page, really.
So one of the things that we run into a lot with that and that kind of deadline and making sure that everyone is on the same page is the concept of scope, right? Scope, defining MVP, making sure we've got our requirements all clearly listed and that type of thing. How do you guys deal with, or how do you view scope creep, MVP definition? Like, where does that fit? And I know you can start with Zack a lot because he's our engineering voice. But Zack, where does that fit kind of in your purview? Like, where do you land in scope? What's your job there?
So I think I'm going to be a broken record here, but again, it's communication. We need to work with our product partners to kind of understand, what does an MVP look like? In Agile, you're not necessarily waiting for the whole thing to be done. This product you're making evolves during the process. So we don't expect all of the answers necessarily about how we're going to do things or what's involved, but we do really need a clear expectation of what the end result needs to be. I'll use an example of effectively maybe one of the last projects Britt and I worked on. The definition of success was it needs to be configurable. And when asked to expound upon what configurable meant, the answer I got was configurable. There was no, maybe it was a little bit of a cop-out answer from the business side, but Britt and I managed to sit down and work through exactly what was going to be configurable. It could just do everything, however you wanted it, whenever you wanted it. We would have engineered the perfect product and we wouldn't need jobs anymore. It's really critical to have a really good understanding of what the business is looking to accomplish and constantly refining that as we complete the stories that make the epics that lead to the feature release.
Yeah, what I love about that answer is that there's a lot of very engineering view in it, right? We need to know, and we have these things. And one of the things that's tough on the product side is that we have our definitions of what scope is. It's coming from so many different inputs, and sometimes those inputs are late, right? Or sometimes it's something that got realized in the room. And when I'm wearing my design hat, I run into this all the time. I mean, the number. I don't know if I've had an engagement where someone hasn't said, you know what we could do, like halfway through the sprint cycle or something like that. So the inputs on the product side are so constant and so flowing that it's really hard to kind of like try and lock things down from the engineering perspective. And that's one of the troubles, one of the problems that we get in is, we say, this is our scope as far as we understand it. And then when it changes or it shifts, which is kind of a natural part of doing business, a lot of times we get a lot of pushback because like, oh, no, you said you needed this. It's like, well, things change, things adapt. BA, product folks, how do you balance that?
Go ahead, Larissa.
I guess from a VA perspective, it gets a little bit tactical, but making sure that we're sharing with the engineers future information, even if it doesn't impact this present feature scope or this present phase. I think that's helpful to making sure that the flex is not as extreme when the changes come, but also keeping in mind at all times the user perspective will help us think through some of those things like you do with the design. If you're thinking through it in the requirements, how is the user going to interact with this? How is the user going to process their workflow through this, we can work through some of those things before it hits development.
Yeah, and those are great points, Larissa. I always look at it from that aspect and look at it from a holistic standpoint, understanding, that there is the product vision. I like to make sure that everyone's in alignment with that. There's always a roadmap that's going to go along with the product vision of how we're going to achieve what we're set out to achieve. And then just constantly, having conversations and keeping open communication about it to make sure that we're aligned with what we're building throughout that development lifecycle. And Joe, you brought up interesting points, because I have also been in situations and engagements where we would have UX design reviews, and I would be in there from a BA perspective or from a product perspective, listening, taking notes, and the conversations would be like, you know what, that is great. I love that flow. Could we possibly do this, add to it, and, add this item, this enhancement that we didn't think about until you showed us this amazing design. And what I like to do is make sure that those items are identified, and we have conversations with those stakeholders of, are these items things that you would like to have, or are they something that you absolutely must have in order to release this product? And that usually starts a really good conversation of having people be cognizant about it, thinking about it, and saying, it's a would like to have, let's, kind of talk about it later. And keeping those items, in an ongoing backlog, and letting stakeholders know that we will be discussing those at later dates. That idea has been heard. We are going to talk about it. There's an organization of those ideas, wants, thoughts, and needs, to make sure that they're feeling heard and understood. So again, open communication, having constant conversations, and then just making sure that, I'm looking at it holistically.
Yeah, that concept of prioritization is really interesting. I know I have done many exercises with stakeholders to try and help them focus that level of prioritization. And sometimes it's tough, right? The best idea in the room sometimes feels like it must be a must-have, right? And I find that if you have done your pre-work, like Larissa was talking about, and you help kind of set those goals, you can always push those ideas into the new goals and say, does this meet these needs? Does this meet our definition of MVP? And it makes the deciding process a lot easier, as opposed to just being in the room and being like, so would you say that's a must-have or a like-to-have? And everybody who loves the idea is like, well, that's clearly a must-have.
Yep.
Because it's so good and we must do it, and it must be done in a couple of weeks, Zack. So I want to make sure that we've got enough time for open Q&A. But what I'd like to do is go through the group and say from your seat, speaking to either product or engineering, or those who are lucky enough to try and balance both sides, what are your final thoughts? What are the things that you want people to be left with? And we'll start with Britt, because we always start with Zack.
Surprise. Some of lasting thoughts, I just like to reiterate that, we're all partners throughout the entire project. It is extremely important to maintain those strong relationships and ongoing leadership. I will never, have the type of leadership style that is more like, just do it because it needs to be done, but more of having those conversations and thinking through things together, getting engineering in the room as early as possible, because product visions are very grandiose. We have great ideas that we want to turn into products. Engineering has the technical know-how to know if it definitely is possible, or if something could possibly be enhanced that we didn't think of. So having those conversations early in the process, I think, sets the team up really well for success. And just continuing to have that type of relationship and leadership, I think, is probably the most important part, in addition to communicating. I know that was a big surprise.
Larissa, what do you think?
Well, actually, I want to speak about communicating because it was a theme through here, but working with you guys during this webinar and outside on projects, I think that the underlining ingredient for successful communication is actually respect. And that's kind of what we were talking about here today is respecting the perspective that we don't understand, that we don't come from. And if we keep respect in our minds, that communication is going to be easier. From a BA perspective, I think it's an ongoing challenge for us to continue to develop our business knowledge, all the business knowledge that we gain in prior engagements, in prior applications can be used, whether it's the same industry or not. And in continuing also to increase our technical knowledge, our knowledge of how things work, not to the level of a developer, but to understand the impact of what some future requirement may make a difference to an existing feature. If I say this is a true false, and I know in the future it's a true false maybe, I need to understand that that's going to impact how a developer or a data architect might make their decisions, and kind of keep those elements in mind when we're communicating.
Love that. All right, Zach, you're up.
I think, again, you're not going to believe it. I think communication is really important. I think Larissa bringing up respect is another thing that's very important. I actually think that communication is a big sign of respect. If you're just throwing things over the wall and you're not talking to each other, there's no mutual acknowledgement of what you're doing. You're not bringing what you have to offer to the table. You're not allowing somebody else to bring what they have to offer to the table. And I think that fostering that is really important. Something in my current engagement that's been really nice. Is making sure that we're engaged with the product side of the house all the way to the product, all the way to the project. We happen to have we're using Storybook and Chromatic to develop front-end components for an in-house design system. And so, this is a technology solution being brought to product so that product can take a look at our work in stride. They can see our check-ins. They can see the progress we're making at a whim. They can make comments on it. They can ensure that it works. They can sign off on it. So, by having engineering involved from the start, we were able to put a solution in place that doesn't necessarily build that product out, but it actually builds our communication process more effectively. So we now have, I wonder what Zack's up to. I go to his most recent commit in Chromatic, and there it is. And I can go through that and I can see how far he's gone, how far he's not gone. I can see as a UX person, like, now that I see that working, I feel like I want to tweak some things. Now that it's out of my head onto Figma, whatever utility you're using, and now it's on interactive. I'm not as big of a fan as I was, and I'd like to change a couple of things. It really allows you to have that communication effectively instead of waiting until, hey, I got a demo in 5 minutes, and we'll probably just critique it all there. And that's not the best way to do it. Again, the best way to do this is everybody's involved from the start. No throwing over walls, no siloing, and just being in constant communication is my thought on how to best bridge gaps.
Between what you guys said about respect and communication, I was thinking, do I have any final thoughts that have been, that haven't been touched on, because that's so good. So I think I can only offer one piece of perspective because I have been a developer, a designer, a product owner. And the only perspective that I can add that hasn't been tossed in here is, if you don't know the names of the people that you're working with, that can get in your way. If you start to just refer to them as engineering or development or product or design, you might get in trouble because you may have stopped thinking about them as people. So if you're in the room, if you're doing the face-to-face thing as often as you can, if you're having that opening communication, I can say, Zack told me this, as opposed to Dev said no, or Joe said this, as opposed to, well, product's changing the requirements on us again. I think that's just a nice little detail to add on to the themes that you guys were talking about of communication and respect, because that's really the ongoing. And also what Zack was saying about getting involved as early as possible, whereas pre-planning and Britt's communication, like make sure that the whole team is involved throughout the product cycle as opposed to just tossing over walls. That was great. Well, thanks, guys. That was a fun conversation. So now we get to go into the bonus round and open it up to Laura for questions. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, we had a lot of great conversation happening in the chat, so I wanted to bring some of those questions to our panel. First one we got is, where does experimentation and discovery fit into scoping?
It's a good one. From a product perspective, discovery, I am a huge fan of continuous discovery. So working on it throughout the entire process and making sure that it's included in the scoping and conversations around scoping. And, you know, letting people know that's what we're doing. We're not only looking at this particular solution right now and going forward and just doing this, we're doing that continuous discovery and thinking about it holistically as we're working through the entire process, and just having those conversations as they arise, really.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for early discovery, right? When you do that kind of initial deep dive and you do the pre-work at the beginning. You know, we do the designing, but, you know, like Britt was saying, I also highly advocate for user testing throughout, right? Test your designs, validate your assumptions. And I'm totally going to speak for Zack here, but get engineering involved in discovery as much as possible, because they'll tell you the realistic things that can be done or cannot be done inside of the systems that you probably already have.
Yeah, getting involved early is great from an engineering side, so we can, you know, just on our own discovery, figuring out the best way to accomplish a task. Sometimes we might find that, hey, we lost a subject matter expert at some point along the way, but in digging into the code base, this exists. We have this. You'd be surprised how many times you end up just reinventing the wheel because somebody who knew that wheel was there has exited. And so, you know, instead of spending all this time not in communication, you know, building up this dream product that you didn't know you already had. So it's getting in there and getting involved is doing that discovery is really important from our side too.
Great, thank you. Next question we've got is, what do you think contributes the most to a successful collaboration?
I'm going to say communication.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Zack. I think in addition to that, building, you know, working relationships really helps as well. What I like to do, because we are consultants, we work on different projects constantly with different people every single time. It's not common that you're on the same engagement with the same people that you were on with previously. So what I, you know, always do is try to meet with each person on the team individually and just have conversations with them. Here's a little bit about me. Tell me a little bit about you. What's your working style? What kind of things do you like to do? And just being able to have those conversations and build that kind of rapport with your internal team, I think is, you know, hugely successful in aiding in that as well. And then having working sessions with the entire team together. So having those same conversations with the entire group of what hours do you work? What type of communication do you prefer? And establishing those working relationships as a group in addition to individually.
Awesome, thank you. Now, have you all ever experienced a project that was on time, in budget, and had no technical debt?
Maybe only in my dreams.
That's such a good question. I have experienced shorter term projects that are on time, on budget, hit all the requirements, And I feel like the more bloated a project becomes, the harder it is to control those things, which is why Agile came to popularity, because it took these giant projects and shrunk them down into 2-week increments. Larissa, I know you're kind of the master of the Agile waterfall dance. Do you have any perspective on how to pull that off?
I get, yeah. So I've definitely had success in that, actually in the waterfall world, but it was working with, with a really lean project. And we had processes in place that were, I don't know, reflective of what Agile came to be. So we had cut out some of the waterfall issues with that people, that drove people to Agile to begin with. But I think the ones that were successful, there were teams that knew how to work together, or that were knew how to build themselves as a team, kind of what Britt spoke to in the last question. And I think that having those collaborations between the business or the product side and the tech teams, that's when it was successful, when there was that ongoing communication throughout the entire project. And yeah.
Let me see, Laura, we got time for one more? We have one more.
Yes, we've got time for one more. What is an example of a specific challenge between stakeholders and engineers, and how did you resolve it, or how was it resolved?
It's funny.
I think I go for it,
there. Oh, I was going to start thinking my way through it. So please go.
I was going to say, one of the things that I brought up in one of my earlier examples was this configurable utility, where it was not to it's like pulling teeth to kind of get concrete examples, it's not intractable, but when it gets that difficult to move forward, what ends up happening is the developers have to develop. We have to produce something, right? And so we end up connecting the dots for you. And in our particular case, we just made this thing that was so flexible and so configurable that the people that wanted to use it didn't even know what to do with it, because it was too many options all at once. It kind of, unfortunately, almost took seeing what we could do to realize I didn't want that. Kind of the way I usually phrase it is, I can't tell you what I want, but I can tell you that you're not doing it. So it's sometimes you find yourself in those situations, and those are hard to work through and get through. But one way or another, the issues come to a head, and something happens.
Laura, I'll give you a happy ending version of that. So I was working with a client who had, we'll say 17, I don't remember the exact number, but separate systems and separate places where they were holding data. And they wanted to bring everything under one banner and put they called it a single point of truth, right? You hear that term a lot, like this is where we're going to go, where everything is. And they drew their maps and their diagrams, and everything was really beautiful on the product side. And they took it over to get it scoped. And they were like, well, that's a 5-year project, guys. It's a little bit too much. So what resulted was a great conversation between both sides, right? Product and engineering, to say, okay, well, what is the core need, right? Where is this fragmentation causing problems, despite the fact that it's ugly to look at? And then by the two pieces working together, and engineering being able to say, well, the data fragmentation over here is terrible because it's making this take 5 times as long, and product being able to say, well, the fragmentation over here is a problem because I don't know where to go. They were able to scope that down together into about a year-long project that got people what they needed, and then could be built on top of that. So it's really that kind of core communication and collaboration that made that one a success. And I'm happy to still be talking about it because it was a good one.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Laura.
All right. So we will call that a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us probably through Laura. I don't know if that's where the contact information goes. But have a great day. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.